All right, let's get going. My name is Kevin Dorr. I am a solutions engineer for Alfresco in the United States, as you can probably tell by my accent, and I work with the partner channel. So I'm going to do a talk today about our new records management product, which we're really excited about. It's got some great features. It's not going to be really technical at a real detailed level, but it's sort of a discussion about how records managers can use it to do their functions better. Are there some records managers here in the audience at all? No? Not a single one, huh? Okay, well, so I hope that the level of the talk is going to work out for everybody then. So let me start off by talking about some things that are important to records managers. I got an AIM report the other day that had some fairly startling figures in it that they talked about. And they said that by 2020, that's only 7 years from now, there'll be 50 times more information to manage than there is right now. And that's just astounding to me. Smartphones will have the capability of Watson, which I don't know if you saw that when it won Jeopardy, but that was fairly impressive. And so records and information management for companies is really a big deal, especially with that much information. So there's a lot of things that people really need to keep track of in order to protect their businesses. And so it's going to continue to grow, and there's a real need to be able to manage it correctly. So let's talk some about what record managers really care about. Well, the first thing that records managers really care about is having support for litigation, because what records really do for you is it's able to prove that you are in compliance with laws, that you have treated people fairly, that you invented stuff before somebody else. There's a whole bunch of things that can happen to your company from a lawsuit standpoint that records can back you up for when you're sued. So that's almost one of the primary functions of a records management system. Secondly, I don't know if you guys can see the joke in the back. Can you guys read what that says in the back? So you probably have some people like this in your company that they don't know exactly where they've put everything, and so you don't really want to have that situation where somebody's invented something new and you can't really dig out the specs for it. So another important facet of records management is having data in a secure place where you know where it is. Another thing that records managers care about, I thought this picture was really pretty funny. This lady used to work as a suicide counselor in San Francisco, and she's holding a burnt console now, and she works as a data crisis counselor. So another important function of records management is to make sure that your content is safe. As you might recognize this picture from the end of the first Indiana Jones movie, where they had the Ark of the Covenant, and they were filing it away in the government warehouse. So that you need to make sure that you have your content correctly tagged so that you can find it again later. And that's another big issue for records managers, because not everybody is able to tag their content correctly. In addition, you need to make sure that your content is securely protected against people that shouldn't be able to see it, and also that people that should be able to see it are able to access it. Finally, I don't know if your company has a warehouse like this, but some companies actually do, where they store their paper records in little banker's boxes and need a forklift in order to pull them out and find them. So a really important consideration is scalability and being able to manage costs as your records grow. So let's talk about some basic records management functions that you would need to have. So our records management product provides these for you. The RM starts off basically with a single server that you've got Alfresco on. And then RM is added on to that server as an add-on product, an AMP file. So they're bound together, essentially. So you've got the advantage that you've got your content management system set up along with your records management system so you can communicate between the two. In addition, records management allows you to cluster so you can scale an organization. So that's also built in to the base product of Alfresco now. Now, the way that Alfresco is organized is using the user interface, Alfresco Share. And Alfresco Share lets you set up different places to store content called sites. Then when you add the records management module in, it sets up a special site that's a single central site that all of the other shares, or all the other share sites can leverage. And the records management site has special properties that allow you to centrally manage and manipulate your records content. So that's actually an advantage over some types of record management systems that are distributed or non-centralized. So records management has what is called a file plan. So a file plan is where you put your content. And that looks like this. It's just a series of files and folders, essentially. But in the records management system, it's actually a specialized set of those. So the central thing there, called a category, is where you put what's called a disposition schedule. And a disposition schedule is what you use to determine how long content should be held and what should happen to it after it becomes a record. Using that structure, we're able to do some interesting things. So one of the things that we can do is we can use that to define the DoD 5015 standard structure, which is a standard that's promulgated by the Department of Defense in the United States. And it's one of the primary standards for records management in the world. So we're actually standards-based. It's been certified again this year by the Department of Defense. And so what we've done is we've taken the three constructs that we've defined there and set them up in this structure here, which is the single standard structure that that standard calls for. But you can also do some other interesting things. We've extended it so that you can define any arbitrary complex structure, and you can include categories within categories. You can have folders at any level. So you can make a complex structure that actually is appropriate for your business, which was a problem with the older standard because it forced you sort of into that DoD structure. So here's what a file plan looks like in the Alfresco user interface. And some things you would notice about this is that on the side there is the categories and folders. And then this is a listing of a particular directory. So file plans can be defined using XML. I don't actually have an example of that today, but pardon me. You can set up a piece of XML that can be loaded then by the loader that we have built into the product. And you can use that to set up a number of different other servers for testing or for just to see how things work. So that's another good feature of the product. Now, another thing that's really important in terms of records management is to be able to have metadata. So when you define a content object, you've got a set of metadata that is set up with that. So Alfresco has a very flexible metadata model. You can set it to a particular type that is appropriate for the content. But when you create a record, it actually appends on another set of data that marks it as being a record. So that's another sort of little tag. And in addition to that, you can append on some additional metadata. So in Alfresco, if you're familiar with how the content model works, there's a structure called an aspect, and you can append on additional aspects as you define records. So if there's record-specific metadata that you need to keep, you can add those on at the time the record is created. So some examples of additional specific metadata, these are the ones from the DoD standard, is you can have ones for scanned data or PDFs, that type of thing. Plus, we also allow you to make custom representations of data. So you can add data onto the record structure itself, or you can define your own aspects using the content model so that you can keep metadata that's important to you. And that's, once again, what it looks like in the user interface. When you define a record, there's a mechanism to allow you to append data onto the record, and that's essentially what's happening here. Here's an example of defining a custom type. So this is a little content model piece of XML that shows how you would do that. And basically all that you need to do that is to reference the bold item here, which is the parent type for the record metadata. So if you use that, that tells Alfresco that that's actually a piece of record metadata. In addition, you can also use the user interface to define additional pieces of metadata that are single element pieces of metadata as well. So you can see once again, here's some of the custom metadata types that we have, and then there's a mechanism there to edit those and add pieces of metadata. Next, in order to have a full-featured records management system, you, pardon me, you need to have a disposition schedule. So on the category, there is a mechanism to set up a disposition schedule. And a disposition schedule is defined by several different, essentially, states that the content contained in the category can be in. So these are the states that are typically defined. So a cutoff means that you have stopped editing on a folder or a piece of content. Retain is how long you want to hold the content, because another important facet of records management is that you don't want to be able to hold content past when it expires, because that can also present a legal problem for you as well. So if you need to hold content for 5 years, you should hold it for 5 years and then get rid of it, instead of just keeping it forever, which is a big problem with using like paper, for example. You can also transfer or do what we call an accession. So transferring it means to move it to another records management site. An accession means to move it to an archival site. This is typically used for like the National Archives in the United States, for example. And then finally, you can destroy the content after the retention period has expired. So that actually marks it for permanent removal. So like I said, those are all state transitions, and they can be based on either a date being hit or a particular event. And I'll talk some more about what an event is in a minute. And those can be applied to the contents of a file, or they can be applied to individual content items. So this is what the user interface for that looks like. So this may be really hard for you guys to see in the back, but you can check the slides later on, I suppose. So this is a disposition schedule that's been created in a folder. And so what the disposition schedule says is to cut the folder off after 10 days. So I allow editing for 10 days. Then I retain that content for 5 years. Then I would send it to like the National Archives and then get rid of it out of my archives, local archives. And that's a typical type of thing you would do. This is a screen that shows how you define a disposition schedule, and there's a couple of interesting things to point out here. So remember I said you can have either an event trigger or a date trigger, so you get your choice of which one of those to use, or you can use both of them if you want to, and then it's a matter of which thing happens first as to which triggers it. And then you can also have it trigger on an event, and there's a list of events here. So those are things like a case is closed or something else that has happened, and somebody actually has to do that physically to the content in order for that to pass that event. We also allow you to define events. So if you have an event that we have not provided out of the box, you can define your own. So this is the list of events that we ship with out of the box. But we also let you make a new one. So if there's something that we haven't handled that's specific to your business, it's very simple for you to set that up. In addition, you also need to have access security, like we talked about in the beginning. So the way that our access security works is you can set it up on a particular user or a group of users. So there's a fairly involved mechanism to set up groups to the extent that you want to. And then we have permissions that are set up on an individual folder level to allow you read or write access to that folder. This screen shows how you can assign different users to an action. And so this is actually kind of an interesting concept. So in terms of the previous screen that I showed, that's just being able to get into the area where your content is stored. But this screen also actually allows you to control which actions a particular user can take. So for example, an administrator can take these particular actions against the content, and you have the ability to change that and take actions away or add actions on a particular user by user basis or group basis if you want to. So if you don't want your administrators to be able to do closing folders, for example, then you can just remove that from the screen. And that's all built in as part of the console that we provide with Records Management. Here's a screen that shows how users are assigned to particular roles. So there's a mapping between individual users and the rights that they have in the Records Management site. Another really important aspect of Records Management is to be able to audit content. So we have audit built into Alfresco, actually into the base product, but it's not really exposed through a user interface. In Records Management, however, it is exposed through a user interface. So it's very simple to create an audit. You can do it with a single click, and it will show you the entire edit history of a particular folder or piece of content. And then you can also save that as its own record so that you can use that as additional proof that somebody has not gone in and made modifications to an important file. Now, it's important for your users to be able to help you out with records management. So one of the problems with records is, though, it's really hard to keep records, and not everybody wants to do it, and you can end up looking like this, which looks a lot like my office, actually. So what we've done in Records Management 2.1 is we've defined a really simple mechanism that allows people to create records with a single keystroke or a single click of a mouse. And that's called in-place records management. So basically what you do is you say, I want to declare the content that I'm working on here in this folder that's in my content management side of my Alfresco application as a record. So there's a menu item or a mouse click that allows you to do that. What that does then is it actually physically moves the content file from your content management side of the house over into the records management part of Alfresco, into the records management site. And the reason that the records management site here is kind of fuzzy is because users don't really need to know what the internal structure of records management is at all. They just declare the record and everything else is taken care of for them automatically by Alfresco. So what happens after that then is there's a kind of record marker that's created back in the content management side that points to the record that's been created in the records management site. And if things get moved around inside of the records management site, that marker tracks the movement so that it always points to the right place. And so what that means is that if I'm a user in my contract site and I know where I put a contract in a particular folder structure, that all I need to know is where I had it, and I can reference it from there. So I can go back to where I created the record from, and there's still a little stub there that lets me get at the actual record that's in the records management site, which is really a cool feature. So here's an example of that in our user interface. So this is in a content management site called Case Management. So the first thing you'll see here is that there's a menu of items that you can select on a particular content item. And all the way at the bottom down here is declare as record. So if I pull the menu down, I click on declare as record, then what happens is it moves the content and it makes a marker like one shown at the top there. The little icon, the tiny icon that you can see next to the larger icon is actually a marker that we put on content that says this is actually a declared record. And you'll also see that there's a piece of metadata there that has a records management ID. So that's what it looks like when you declare a record. So you may ask, well, so what happens? Where does that go? Well, if I've got my content management sites over here on the far side of the screen, and my record management site, it's got a whole bunch of folders that I want to put my content someplace. How does it get from one place to the other? Well, we have a kind of funnel that all of the records go into, and they go into a single folder, special folder in the records management site. So the single folder is called unfiled records. It kind of makes sense when you think about it. And there's a lot of really interesting things that you can do with the unfiled records folder. But essentially from there, you can either file the content or you can do something else with it. And so you've got pretty much full control over what happens once it goes into that folder. So here's some options that you can take for records that are in that folder or that have been declared. You can file it someplace into the file plan. You can complete the record or add additional metadata like we saw earlier. Sometimes in order to complete a record, you actually have to fill out metadata, and I'll talk about that in a little while too. You can ask a user for more information about why they wanted to make this a record. And what that actually does is it kicks off a workflow that sends a query back to the original user that declared the record and says, why are you making this a record? So you get some information back about what the intent was. Or you can just reject the record creation. You can say, I don't think this ought to be a record, and it removes it back out of the records management system. So that all sounds pretty good, but not everybody's going to be able to do that, right? So not all your users are going to cooperate with you and declare records when they ought to and that type of thing. So, well, how do you get around that problem? Well, Alfresco's got a bunch of interesting features built into it that essentially allows you to automate end-to-end being able to capture records and put them into the records management content store. So here's an example of that. We have a mechanism that is called a folder rule. And you can say on a particular folder, if a condition happens, then you can declare a record. So that condition might be a user has gone in and edited a piece of metadata and changed its value, for example. Or it might be just that the content has gone into the folder, for example. And so once again, it declares it into the records management folder, so it goes into the unfiled records folder. Here's an example of how that works in our user interface. So here's a rule that I've got set up that when an item is added to a particular folder, it declares it as a record. And you can say, I want to declare this a record and make it go away in the content management system, or I can keep it there with the marker behind. So it gives you a lot of control. In fact, here's an example here of all of the different types of functions that you can, that are actually built in now to Alfresco when you add the records management module. for rule creation. So there's a fairly involved, these are actually all records management functions that you can do. So you can, in addition to declaring records, you can, for example, freeze a record. You can do that all, pretty much any type of function that you can do inside the records management repository just from the rule. So a second way, like I said, is a user might take an action. So in this case, an action might be to move a piece of content from one folder to another. So the situation here might be I'm working on some active contracts, and now I've got a completed contract, and once it gets into a completed state, I want to make a record out of that. So the user just moves the content from active to completed, a rule fires, and that goes to the records management system. So you can see there's a lot of automation that you can actually apply to make sure that that type of thing happens automatically on the content management end. Another thing that you can do is you can actually integrate it with our activity workflow. So this situation is actually fairly interesting for something like social publishing. Alfresco has some content mechanisms built in on the content management side that allow you to publish content to like Twitter or Flickr or that type of thing. So if your company is pushing content out, that's actually a public record, right? That it's something that the company has said, and you might want to capture that. So if you use Alfresco to actually publish to Twitter, this might be a scenario that you could use. So you could make up a tweet. If there's a legal department that has to approve your tweets, you could have it reviewed, and then you can have a review and edit loop, and then it gets published. Once it's published, you can verify that it's been published, and then you could create a record out of it using our records management service interface. So you can create it directly from the workflow, so the actual completion of the workflow actually moves it into the records management system, so there's that type of automation as well. So all that stuff is just moving content into my unfiled records folder. Now, what happens after that? Well, hopefully you don't end up with this guy, but you can do some pretty interesting things with your unfiled records folder, as it turns out. One thing that you can do is you can put rules on the unfiled records folder too, and you can put a whole bunch of rules on this particular folder. So you could say, if a particular condition comes in, like this file has a particular type of name or it's a particular type of content object, then I can file it automatically someplace into my file plan. Or you can also use that to set metadata. You could use it to reject it. You could use it to ask for more information, or any of the other records management functions that are specific to the records management system. So here's what that looks like in the user interface. So here's my unfiled records folder. And this is probably really, really hard to read, especially even in the front row. But this files the record to a particular location in the file plan. And the interesting part about this particular string is that it has a partial fixed path, but then it has a substitution path at the end. And that's another really interesting feature that I'll talk about in a second called dynamic filing. Once again, here's a list of things that you can do in terms of the rules that you can create in the records management system. And this is actually a different list than the one that I showed for the content management site a second ago. So let's talk about dynamic file plan management. Well, what does that mean? So if I've got a file tree where I've set up, for example, a Freedom of Information Act request, like the US government has those so that you can find out how many times they've tapped your cell phone. You might have a folder that has requests for 2013. Well, if the fiscal year flips over, I don't want to have to go in and manually create another folder. So what I'd like to be able to do is automatically create another folder for new requests that come in. So then I don't have to worry about having to maintain my file plan. So the way to do that is like this. The red part of the string that you can see here is what we call a dynamic substitution. And so you can see here what happens is it looks at a specific piece of metadata, which is today's date and the year, and then it takes that string and appends it onto the file path. So it actually dynamically makes up a folder called FY 2014. So here's an example of some other substitutions, and this, once again, is very, very flexible mechanism. You can substitute in almost any type of date thing, or you can use any attribute that's present on the content itself. So you can take like company names, client names, contract types, whatever. And you're able to define rules. So the record manager himself can actually define the rules as to how the content should be stored instead of actually going in and storing it himself. Another thing that you could do is to automatically fill out metadata. So, and this is where this gets fairly interesting for records managers. So my unfiled records folder could have a rule on it that calls what we call a web script in Alfresco. So a web script is like a little piece of code, and that code can connect to almost anything and do, anything that a program can do. So one thing that it could do is it could take the content file and send it out for semantic analysis. So there's a number of different types of commercial programs that do semantic analysis or even open source ones. And you could have the content analyzed to see what it thinks it means, and you can use that to actually tag the content for storage then. So you can have that rule fire, you can have it stored in a particular place in the file plan, and you can have it tagged in such a way that the content is stored correctly. Remember, we talked about the Indiana Jones problem. So that you've actually got correct metadata on it so that it's set up so you can find it later. In addition, you can also use that to extract metadata and automatically fill out tags directly out of a document as well. And then once that's done, you can store it back into the file plan. Another interesting trick that you can do is you could have a rule fire or a workflow fire that, once again, calls a web script. And web scripts can also have a Java-backed component to them. So what that means for you is that any other application program that has an API can actually be used by a web script to pull data out of that remote application. So that might be that you want to go and pull content out of Outlook, for example, or you could go scan Twitter pages looking for things about your company. You could pull data out of a relational database, for example, or even an enterprise resource type of application like SAP, or pretty much anything else that you can even imagine. So it gives you, the underlying way that Alfresco is set up actually gives you an immense amount of power in order to be able to go and pull content that you want to make a record and put it into our records management system. And once again, then it goes into my unfiled records where it can finish its life. So finally, you need to be able to find your content after you've put it someplace. So RM has a bunch of different searching capabilities that are not present in the normal Alfresco that you may be familiar with. So I've got a content object. The content object has a bunch of text in it. And it's got a bunch of metadata that was set up in the original object, presumably. So I can use that metadata set to search for it, or I can do a full text search on the original text of the document. In addition, I can also search by the metadata fields that are associated to the record when it was tagged as a record, or if there's additional optional metadata that got associated onto it as the aspect, I can also use those sets of metadata as well. And another interesting thing is you can search by the state of the content in the disposition schedule. So you can say, search for content where this event has happened to it, or this action has been taken against it, or that type of thing. So you can actually also search for content by its particular state as well. In addition, you can also save the searches so that they can be used again and again And that's a really interesting feature. So here's what that looks like once again in the user interface. This particular thing is showing you how you would set up a query. The searching interface here is a little bit different than the one in Alfresco 2. It's kind of fixed in a way that's not particularly possible in the general content management system. But this lets you kind of build up a query just by pointing and clicking, so it looks through different sets of content. Oops, I backed up. There we go. Here's another screen here that actually has a query executed or ready to execute. Another thing that you can do is after the query is run, you can specify which pieces of metadata you would like to have in the output. And you can also can queries as well. So there's a number of queries that ship with Alfresco out of the box. Here's one here, so you can see the query syntax. But you can also add to the queries that are shipped out of the box as well. There's a mechanism to configure those as well. A final piece of that is to be able to specify which things have been used in legal cases or pending litigation. So that's called a legal hold. You can go into pieces of content and say this content needs to be frozen in the current state that it's in no matter what happens, if an event happens or a date happens or whatever. And it needs to stay that way because it's part of a pending legal case. So that's just an action that you can go in and take on any piece of content in the records management repository. And it marks it as being frozen, and then it also puts it into this particular directory here called holds so that you can easily find those and identify them later. So, what have we learned today? Well, for litigation, we have a number of different features that can really help you out that way. In addition to all the basic content features that our records management product provides, we also have this end-to-end automation thing. So it keeps you from missing content that might otherwise slip through the cracks or cause you problems because they haven't been filed or captured correctly. Your important data that you need to keep, we've got certainly mechanisms to make sure that you don't lose that. In terms of security, we went over some of the secure access features of Alfresco. There's quite a number of those built in. And in terms of safety, having the centralized content store allows you to easily create backup schemes that will protect that data as well. In terms of correctness, we looked at how automation can be used to fire off external programs to categorize data or to capture data to make sure that you get the right results and metadata set up. And then Alfresco is very reasonably priced. Records management is also very reasonably priced. And it allows you to scale by adding additional hardware in a cluster. So we have that one covered too. So finally, I guess the message here really would be is that our RM product allows you to, as a records manager, define the rules for how your records ought to be managed instead of actually being like a record keeper where you're in actually making sure that things get filed on a physical level. So that's really the bottom line, is that you can kind of just think about how things need to happen instead of really doing them yourself and use automation to do that for you. So that's the end of my talk. Are there any questions? Sure. Or wait, hang on a sec. I guess we need to have the microphone.
First, congratulations on the solution. I just got the impression that you moved from a apparently unconfigurable black box now to something which is really useful. That's very nice. Thank you for that.
Well, we're very excited about the new implementation. Actually, this is our engineer who wrote the thing completely over in the front row here. So, round of applause for Mr. Wetherall.
So I got two really technical questions just out of interest. First one, you said that the document will be moved to the records management site, and you can keep a link to that. That does technical mean you're creating a new node with, which has a peer-to-peer connection, or is this any additional metadata you add to the content?
You might want to answer that yourself, actually, because I'm not sure exactly how that is implemented.
It's a secondary.
It's important that there's only one copy of the record. So what you see is actually in both places is the same document. And we literally use, obviously what we do is when we declare it as a record, we move the primary parenting to the file plan. So that means the file plan owns it, and then we create a secondary association, child association, to the original location. So as far as the user is concerned, it looks like it's in both places, if they can see it in both places, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was just asking this because this is a question I will be asked, I'm sure, later. When you're running these rules on the unfiled records folder, normally they have to be running in a user context. So when a user is not allowed to access the records management, when this user declares the file as a record, in which context do you run these rules, filing the objects?
You can do that one too.
Yeah, that's actually very well spotted, and you're right, it is a bit of a problem. So what we do in records management for the time being, we have a capability that determines whether or not you can create and manage rules in the first place. So you have to have that capability, and that means that rule creation is protected sufficiently so that when the RM rules are executed, they're actually executed as the RM administrator. Okay, we actually have a system user that we added into, one called RM admin, that you can't actually log in as, but it has all of the records administration rights for all of the file plans when we get to multiple file plans. And if you want to, you could actually set a password for that as admin and use that as a delegated administration role. But ultimately what we'll do is we'll hopefully be able to extend the rules mechanism so that we can actually say, I want this run as RM admin, or I would like it run as some other role, perhaps. But at the moment, that's what it does.
Okay. There's a...
So, hello, I have a question how the archiving exactly works. Do you move the content to the archive server and let the metadata in the Alfresco stores?
No, we don't at the moment. At the moment, everything stays, the physical content stays where it is. So it's still in the content store. If you like, the RM solution is more about tracking, like, you know, the life cycle of things and where things are. So when you're transferring stuff after the event, at the moment it's a kind of, not really a manual process, but you're kind of guided through the process of, you know, given the content and where do you move it and all that kind of stuff. If we want to go down the route of, you know, actually being able to determine exactly where that content is stored and being able to move it like on-site or off-site, that's probably a conversation we need to have with Derek and find out where we are with that. Because we kind of need to be able to, at the moment, my knowledge of the content store is fairly black box. So I don't know where we are in terms of being able to actually say, this content has to be there, you know, which we may need to do. Yeah, that's right, yeah.
The contents that didn't get this cutoff mark, but in all phases of this retention, I get sorted for this content.
Yeah, that's right. It's just asking whether you can search for it after it's been cut off. Yeah, basically, depending on who you are, and depending on your permissions, and depending on your capabilities, will directly depend on whether you can still see it. So in some situations, if you haven't got sufficient permissions, you know, after it's cut off, you may no longer be able to find it. but that will depend on your access rights. But otherwise, yeah, you'll be able to find it. If you've got permission, you'll be able to find it. Yeah.
And the next question, this retention configuration, when the cutoff mark will be set, when it will be transferred, do I define this as a category, on the record, or on the top folder?
Right. So the question is just asking where do we define the disposition schedule? Yeah. So you can define a disposition schedule on any record category, anywhere in that hierarchy. And record categories go within record categories, and then you get to the bottom where there's a folder, which is a disposable item in our world. And so that means you've got control over, you can actually reuse your category over fairly large structures. But you can also overwrite those further down the hierarchy. So you can have like a general, classification for HR documents, and you might say, but for executives, we have to keep them for an extra 5 years. And so you do that further down the hierarchy.
So they inherit downwards until there's another category found, and then it keeps on going from there.
So the last question for me, sorry. So you told you create multi-parents if you move to the record management side. It means the document is still searchable on the old position with past previous or something?
Yeah, so when we, yes and no. So it's discoverable with the secondary path, but when you search for it, you'll likely be redirected to the primary path. But if you can see it at all, then we guarantee that you have kind of, at least kind of read access through the file plan. Okay, so we do a lot of kind of security mangling and controls and snapshotting when we make the in-place to give these guys a backdoor without having to have an RM role. But we have to do that in a way that's controlled. So we can talk about it offline because it's a little bit more involved, but if you want to know how it works, then we can, yeah.
The use case is very easy. People don't be surprised that the content is available. So if you can find the link, searching on the site, you understood, okay, it's archived.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the active right principle is that, despite the fact it's been made a record, the users that are still got access to it will just be able to find it in their own content authoring environment, and that's kind of the whole point, really. Yeah.
Okay, another question in the back there.
Hi. Do you have support for physical object storage? Typical case would be a paper-based mail that you scan to create an electronic record, and then you assign some type of link to the actual physical storage where the paper document will be stored.
We do. There's an object type that you can create that's just called a physical record. So that has metadata about where the paper record is stored in terms of like warehouse, box, all that stuff, right? And then I think there are some plans to enhance that in the future as well. So yeah, we definitely support that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Another one?
So I think we know that you can take individual items and documents and create records out of them. So if you think of a HR site, new person comes in, here's this new employee paperwork, you put that in the system and it's now a record. Metadata changes, he's fired, and then it goes into the archive. But if you think about it from a project management aspect, so if you have an entire site that may be Chevron, project A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it may have thousands of documents and files and images and contacts, calendars, etc. Is there a way to say, okay, this project is complete, to create that entire site as a record, not necessarily each individual item within it?
Get the mic.
That's a very good question.
That is a good question, yes.
So the short answer is no at the moment, because we do record management, right? And records management, despite the fact that we often talk about their electronic things, it's still a document. It's a PDF, it's a this, it's a that. Obviously, the core product is very much about electronic documents, complex things, right? So a website, a project, email conversation, published Twitter artifacts. So what we want to do going forward is to actually start doing exactly what you're saying. managing electronic documents, so complex things, so hybrid things, you know, where you've got scan electronic, you know, whole clusters of electronic artifacts that you want to treat as a record. And what we will do, the technology will add to enable that is to have the notion of a composite record. Okay, so where we've got, like, if you like, the record folder is like a pivot where we've got, above it we've got all the kind of hierarchical structure we can add the schedules onto, and then beneath that we'll start to add these composite records which can be built up. They're effectively containers, but they can be treated as a record and everything else within it. So we can effectively draw a rubber band around something and say, like, all of these things are interrelated by complex content relationships, but I want to treat them all as a single record. Right, so you can do exactly that. In principle, we'll be able to say, you know, project, snapshot it at this point, at delivery, record everything that happened as one big lump. Okay, but the bad news is that that's not in 2.1. Okay.
All right, any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much for coming. Appreciate it.